Rise of the European Emperor by Taishan Laonyo.
Chapter 641, The Robin Hood Band of Thieves Attacks. In Sherwood Forest in the north of Nottinghamshire, England, in an inconspicuous camp, a conspiracy is unfolding. The two people who are conspiring are Robinson and Hanks, who are ranked at the top two on the British Royal Bounty List. They are the chief and deputy chiefs of the Robin Hood thieves. Of course, these two names are fake. Their real names are Coster and Merrick, and they are Marin's men. This time, they got together to discuss after receiving Marin's secret order. "Hey, Coster, what do you say we should do this time?" Merrick asked. Coster shrugged indifferently and said, "What else can we do? Of course, we should carry out the mission. And, Merrick, here, my name is Robinson. Don't call me by the wrong name, or you will expose your identity." Merrick rolled his eyes and said, "You still call me your real name, and I haven't seen you call me Hanks." After that, the two laughed. Then, they called each other by the two pseudonyms Robinson and Hanks. "By the way, Coster." "Oh no, it's Captain Robinson. Do you think we have a good chance of success in this sneak attack on the British camp? You know, that's the base of the army of the Kingdom of England. I feel a little nervous." "Don't be afraid, Hanks, the master said that the British army has not arrived at the camp yet. At present, there are probably only civilians transporting grain and a small number of guards. After all, most of the wartime people are probably participating in spring plowing in their hometowns at this time. What if there are a lot of guards? No big deal, we will send someone to scout first, and then we can know the specific situation." "Okay." Merrick nodded. Then he said worriedly, "Robinson, do you think those English thieves will be willing to go when we attack the British camp this time? They are all English. If someone is patriotic, they will probably oppose it. They may even leak our plan. At that time, it will be over." Coster thought about it and felt that Merrick's worry was reasonable. After all, these thieves followed him just to survive. Not all of them were bad people. If any of them had a little bit of patriotism and leaked their plan to attack the British camp, it would be the end of them, and people would die. Therefore, Coster and Merrick decided to test their men first. There was no need to test the infantry at all. Because, this time, it was only the 900 cavalry that attacked, and it had nothing to do with the infantry. Therefore, Coster and Merrick only needed to test the 900 cavalry. So, Coster and Merrick held a cocktail party to entertain the 900 horse bandits. When the wine was half drunk, Coster and Merrick began to discuss with their men whether to oppose the King of England. Coster and Merrick loudly stated that Henry VII was a bastard of unknown origin, and he ascended the throne by killing the king, and was not worthy of being the King of England. Therefore, the two planned to openly oppose Henry VII. Then, the two began to observe the reactions of their men. Of course, it was unrealistic for two people to observe 900 people. The two specially selected dozens of their absolute confidants from the infantry to attend the cocktail party, responsible for observing the expressions of the horse bandits. As expected, some of the horse bandits were loyal to the British royal family. They became horse bandits only because they had no choice. After all, several counties in northern England were completely out of food, and the nobles refused to help. The only way to survive was to join the bandits. After listening to the remarks of Coster and Merrick, these people showed unhappy expressions on their faces. And the dozens of infantrymen who were responsible for helping to pour wine, the status of infantrymen was lower than that of cavalrymen, and it was normal for them to be the younger brothers of cavalrymen, happened to observe their reactions. In the end, a total of more than 40 people expressed dissatisfaction with the remarks of the two, and more than 70 people showed hesitation. So, Coster and Merrick determined that these 120 people could not be completely assured. In the following period of time, the 120 horse bandits were transferred to the infantry of the bandit group as officers. It seemed that they were promoted, but they lost the qualification to fight on horseback. The 120 vacancies were filled by Coster and Merrick, who selected 120 infantrymen who were loyal to them, opposed Henry VII, and good at riding horses from more than 7,000 infantrymen. Then, Coster and Merrick conducted a short-term horse combat training for the newly joined 120 horse bandits. Of course, the horse bandits of the Robin Hood thieves were not very good at fighting on horseback. As they deeply implemented the 16-character policy of guerrilla warfare, riding horses was only for the convenience of pursuit and escape, not for confronting the enemy on horseback. Therefore, these horse bandits were actually just infantrymen who were good at riding horses. Of course, they also knew some cavalry fighting methods, but they were not proficient in them. However, they never confronted the regular army of England head-on, so the three-legged cat's cavalry combat level was enough. After all, their opponents were just ordinary rich families. In other words, they mainly dealt with the guards and bodyguards of the rich families. Ordinary rich families naturally could not have a large-scale bodyguard group. Therefore, 900 horse bandits can basically fight against any rich family, and can also completely defeat the manor forces of those small nobles. However, this time they need to attack the military camp. Therefore, under the leadership of the chief and deputy commanders, the horse bandits focused on training the ability to blow up the camp fence and quickly prevent fires in the camp on horseback. According to the reconnaissance of the scouts, the British army camp in Warwickshire was not in the city, mainly because they were afraid that the soldiers of the army could not control themselves and robbed in the city. The military discipline in Europe at that time was very poor, but 10 kilometers north of Birmingham City in the northwest of Warwickshire, Birmingham still belonged to Warwickshire at this time, and West Midlands was separated in 1974. Moreover, the entire camp is made of wood, and the walls are also wooden stake fences. The reason for using wooden structures is mainly to facilitate disassembly and taking away. After all, if the English army goes north, it must change camps. The stone structure camp cannot be moved and is difficult to dismantle. The most convenient is naturally the wooden structure camp. As for the wooden fence is not strong. It's easy to solve. Just dig a trench outside the fence. Moreover, you can place wooden stakes in the trench. This trick was used by the English in the Anglo-French War. If you attack the military camp head-on, you will first taste the wooden stakes in the trench, and you may be skewered as human meat. However, this trick has nothing to do with Marin and his men. Because, for this kind of defense line with wooden stakes in the trench, Marin's army has a perfect solution: fill the pit with wooden boards. Coster and Merrick have also been in Marin's army, so they are naturally familiar with this trick. Therefore, although the British camp has a trench full of wooden stakes outside the wooden fence, it does not have much impact. At that time, 900 horse bandits, no one will carry a wooden board. In addition, they will bring a few gunpowder barrels to blow up the wooden fence. The specific method of bombing is to bury it in the soil next to the wooden fence. When it explodes, the power of the gunpowder barrel will overturn the wooden fence wall and blow out a gap. At this time, the horse bandits came forward and threw wooden boards into the trench to fill it up, so that the horses could step on the wooden boards and rush into the camp. Of course, if the camp is full of British soldiers, this trick will definitely not work. Because the British soldiers will definitely come one after another to plug the entire blown hole. However, the British camp north of Birmingham is now mostly inhabited by non-combatant civilians and a small number of guards. According to the spy's report, the guards only have 500 infantrymen in total, and they only guard the several camp gates around them, which are scattered into several parts. As for the wooden fences, there are no soldiers guarding them. Because there are only 500 guards, it is definitely impossible to take care of every section of the wooden fence. At that time, just send your men to choose a section of the wooden fence that is not guarded, climb over the trench, dig a pit under the wooden fence with a small shovel, bury the gunpowder barrel, and it will be easy to blow up the wooden fence. Then, after filling the trench, 900 horse bandits will rush in together. Although the opponent has 500 people, they are scattered and there is no threat. Moreover, the purpose of the horse bandits was to burn the food and grass, not to destroy the 500 infantrymen, so there was no need to pay any attention to them. And the infantry could not chase the cavalry to their death. Facing the cavalry, the most correct way for the infantry was to form a formation to defend, rather than to take the initiative to attack. Otherwise, they would die very ugly. As for the time of action, in order to catch the enemy by surprise, Coster and Merrick decided to launch it at dawn. At that time, the enemy had not yet gotten up, and even if they got up, they would definitely be in chaos for a while. And the horse bandits could see the situation clearly because of the light, which made it easier to burn the food and grass. If it was in the middle of the night, it would be difficult to see clearly. After making arrangements, Coster and Merrick personally led 900 horse bandits of the Robin Hood Thieves group, left Sherwood Forest in the name of going out to rob food, and quickly rushed to the southwest. Of course, in order to avoid the eyes and ears of the English official army, they took small roads and tried to avoid the sight of the English officials. Otherwise, if the enemy is prepared, it will be difficult to launch a surprise attack. However, what surprised the brothers of Robin Hood's band of thieves was that the two leaders required each bandit to carry a piece of wood and a can of sheep fat for fuel, adding fuel to the fire. There are many sheep in England, so there is a lot of sheep fat. Moreover, they also took a few barrels of gunpowder with them. Chapter 642, Burning the Enemy Camp, Part 1. Along the way, Coster and Merrick took 900 men and chose secluded paths. Moreover, they walked through the forest when they encountered it. They had been in Sherwood Forest for so long that they had become very skilled jungle thieves. Walking in the forest, even if they had never been to the woodland, they would not get lost. Of course, it was precisely because of this characteristic that the two later became cavalry generals of the North American colonial army. Because they were good at leading the horse team through the jungle. Of course, this is a later story. In order to keep it secret, the two traveled during the day and rested at night when passing through the forest. Because there was no one in the forest, there was no need to worry about being discovered. When they arrived at the flat area with people, they changed to traveling in the middle of the night and hiding in a small forest during the day to rest to avoid leaking the news. At that time, there were less than 3 million people in England, and the degree of land development was very limited. Therefore, there were forests and woods everywhere. Therefore, the march of Robin Hood thieves did not alarm the English officials. Of course, their number was limited, and it was difficult to attract the attention of the British army. If thousands of people were dispatched, the alarm bell would be sounded. 900 horse bandits, this number is very uncomfortable. He is not a small number, and the local garrison militia may not be able to beat them. So, try not to provoke them. But 900 people are not too many, so there is no need to send a large army to encircle and suppress them. So, this is a scale that makes the government uncomfortable. Moreover, the horse bandits come and go like the wind, and it is impossible to encircle and suppress them. Whether it is the authentic Robin Hood thieves group in the past or the current copycat Robin Hood thieves group, as long as they get into the jungle, it will be difficult to encircle and suppress them. As for setting fire to the forest, the climate in England is so humid that a rain will put it out for you. After several days of cautious travel, the 900 horse bandits of the Robin Hood thieves group finally entered the territory of Warwickshire. At this time, Coster and Merrick told their men the real task: burning the military camp. The horse bandits under their command suddenly made a commotion. This is the rhythm of openly fighting the King of England. If the British military camp is missing, wouldn't it attract the crazy encirclement and suppression of the English official army? Coster had already thought of a pretext. He told his horse thieves that this British camp was set up to encircle and suppress the bandit groups in several counties in the central region. If the British complete the assembly, they will soon launch an attack on Leicestershire, northeast of Warwickshire. In the forests of Leicestershire, there is also a branch of the Robin Hood bandits. Therefore, this action of the Robin Hood bandits is a preemptive strike. Of course, he did not tell his men that this British camp was actually used for the northern expedition. However, if the northern expedition is successful, it is inevitable to attack the bandit groups in several counties in the central region from the north and south. Therefore, Coster did not completely deceive his men. The horse bandits still had awe of the imperial court's official army, but the spies sent out reported that there were only 500 infantrymen in the camp, and about 3,000 civilians with transportation capacity. The horse thieves immediately regained their confidence. The reason they were timid was that they were afraid that the number of official troops was too large. If there were only 500 infantrymen, there would be no need to worry. What made them feel more at ease was that these 500 infantrymen were all spearmen, and there were no longbowmen. Longbowmen were very lethal to horse thieves. They could still make achievements against plate-armored knights, let alone horse thieves who had basically no armor. Once the rain of arrows came, the horse thieves would definitely suffer heavy casualties. Therefore, the absence of longbowmen was definitely good news for the horse thieves. Although it was easy for horse thieves with sabers in one hand to fail in a frontal charge against spearmen, not all of these horse thieves were melee fighters. Among these horse thieves, there were about 300 archers, who were very restrained against spearmen. England was a country where all people practiced archery. The king required the people to practice archery on weekdays, and even banned football to ensure sufficient time for archery practice. Therefore, there were too many archery masters among the people of England during this period. They were not selected as the longbowmen of the King of England, not because of their poor archery skills. Instead, the longbowmen were required to be over 1.75 meters tall, which eliminated most people. This era was not the era when Europeans were generally tall in later generations. Because of insufficient nutrition, in England, there are not many people over 1.7 meters tall, let alone 1.75 meters tall. Therefore, this rule eliminated most young people. However, there are also many archery masters among those young people who do not meet the height standard. They have been practicing archery since childhood, but they did not grow tall enough. But after more than 10 years of practice, their archery skills are definitely not bad. Therefore, in this era, there are not many prey in the forests of England. Because everyone can shoot arrows, how can those wild animals survive? Unlike Germany at the same time, because archery is not popular, there are quite a lot of prey in the forest. Marin's first startup capital was obtained by poaching in the Black Forest. Of course, being able to shoot arrows does not mean that you can also shoot on horseback. Horseback shooting and foot shooting are two concepts. Therefore, although the Robin Hood thieves group has a huge scale of 7,000 to 8,000 people, Coster and Merrick only selected more than 300 horse bandits who can shoot arrows on horseback and have a good hit rate. At the same time, the bows they use are not English longbows, but recurve bows with shorter bows. After all, a longbow cannot be used when a person is on horseback. With these more than 300 archers, Coster and Merrick have enough confidence to defeat the 500 English spearmen. Speaking of which, this is also Henry VII's mistake. After all, Warwickshire has been taken over by Henry VII's confidants for 20 years and has long been managed as a rear base loyal to Henry VII. Moreover, the Robin Hood bandits mainly operate in Nottinghamshire across Leicestershire. Therefore, Henry VII did not expect that a bandit group would be bold enough to attack the British camp. Of course, because it was still in the confidentiality stage, Henry VII did not know that anyone would know the existence of the camp. In this way, on a dark and windy night, 900 horse thieves of the Robin Hood bandits, under the command of Coster, tied the horses' mouths with cloth strips, to prevent the horses from neighing, which is the method of Marinism, and put foot covers on the horses' hooves to reduce the sound of the horses' hooves. After a series of preparations, the 900 horse thieves stopped 2 kilometers away from a fence of the British camp. Then, he sent several men carrying gunpowder barrels, engineer shovels and wooden boards to quietly move towards the fence of the British camp. When they arrived in front of the camp, several horse thieves carefully placed wooden boards in the trenches filled with wooden stakes. Then, they came under the wooden fence with gunpowder barrels on their backs and stepped on wooden boards. Then, several people began to dig the soil carefully with engineer shovels. In order not to alarm the defenders, their movements were very light, which also caused the digging speed to be very slow. It was not until dawn, which was the scheduled time to launch the attack, that several people hurriedly completed the digging, buried all the gunpowder barrels in the pit, filled them with soil, and stepped on them with their feet, leaving only the fuse exposed outside. Coster and Merrick woke up when it was almost dawn. Before that, they took a short nap with their men. Now, they just woke up. Seeing that the sky was getting a little light, Coster hurriedly sent people to approach the work site, barking like a dog, and asked those who buried the gunpowder barrels whether they had finished. Soon, several cat calls were heard from under the wooden fence of the British camp. This meant that they were ready. So, after receiving the news, Coster and Merrick calmed down, took their well-rested men, put on their clothes, picked up sabers, bows and arrows, sheep oil cans and wooden boards, mounted their horses, and slowly marched towards the British camp. While advancing, Coster also sent someone to inform several men in front of the British fence, they could light the fuse. Chapter 643, Burning the Enemy Camp, Part 2. The sky was getting brighter and brighter, but at this time, people were the most sleepy. Although there was light, the British camp was still quiet. 500 infantrymen and more than 3,000 militiamen were all asleep. Coster's messenger came to the fence and brought not only the order to ignite, but also several lit matches. It was too dangerous to let these demolitionists ignite outside the fence, because the sound of flint ignition might alarm the people inside. So Coster found a hidden place in the temporary station 2 kilometers away to light a pile of fire, and lit several matches and asked the messenger to take them over. The messenger distributed 5 burning matches to 5 demolitionists. Then, he turned around and returned to his team. Several demolitionists began to blow the matches with their mouths to make them burn more vigorously. One of them had a match that had gone out, so he and his companion borrowed fire and relit their own matches. At this time, it was already half light, and the sparks of the match were not as obvious as in the dark. Several people squatted outside the fence of the British camp and blew the fuse, and no one noticed. After making sure that the fuse was fully burned, the 5 people lined up and came to the fuse of the gunpowder barrel they buried. In order to ensure that there was enough width for the cavalry to rush into the camp, Coster brought 5 gunpowder barrels and buried them in 5 places under the wooden fence. The fuses they used were also of the same length to achieve the most synchronous explosion. After getting ready, the 5 people lined up in a row, squatted down one after another, and looked at the fuse on the ground with solemn eyes. The leading demolition captain John counted down in a low voice. 1, 2, 3, FAAIR. After the captain finished counting, the 5 demolitionists pressed the fuse at the same time and ignited the fuse on the ground. Run! John said, turned around and ran without any hesitation. As a demolitionist, he knew the degree of danger of this matter. If he ran slowly, he might be hit by the fragments produced by the explosion, and he would be either dead or injured. Seeing the boss's behavior, the other members also ran to the rear without any hesitation. After a while, the fuse burned out and entered the soil, igniting the gunpowder barrel buried in the soil. Boom 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 dash. 5 consecutive loud noises came, and the ground of the entire British camp trembled. Many British soldiers and civilians were so scared that they jumped out of bed. The power of the 5 gunpowder barrels was indeed extraordinary. After the explosion, the nearby wooden fences were blown away directly. Among them, some of the sharp stakes of the wooden fences flew directly and smashed into the tents in the British camp, directly injuring people. And the wooden fences were all gone in the area where the gunpowder barrels were originally buried. At the same time, 1 kilometer away, 900 horse bandits took their hands off the ears of their war horses after the explosion. Before the explosion, Coster knew that there would be a loud noise. In order to prevent the war horses from being frightened, Coster ordered all horse thieves to cover the ears of their war horses with their hands to prevent the war horses from being frightened. As for the horse bandits themselves, they just need to stuff a piece of rag into their ears. Seeing the explosion over, Coster and his horse bandits took off their hands that were covering the ears of their horses and threw away the rags in their ears. In addition, the horses' foot covers and the cloth strips that tied the horse's mouth were also removed. Then, everyone rode forward holding the wooden planks. A distance of 1 kilometer is not far for the cavalry. Even if they jog, the horses will quickly reach the explosion site. At this time, the wooden fence in this section has disappeared, but the wooden stakes in the trench are still there. So, under Coster's command, the horse bandits threw wooden boards into the trench and filled up a road. Seeing the road appear, Coster drew his saber and ordered loudly, "Brothers, follow me." Then, he took the lead and rode into the British camp, heading straight for the place where food and grass were piled. At this time, the British camp was still in chaos. The 500 regular army spearmen were not in chaos. After a brief panic, they were organized by their respective officers and tried to go to the explosion site to check the situation. However, their calmness does not mean that the civilians are calm. Those civilians were frightened by the violent explosions, and some of them went crazy and started running around. Soon, the civilians in the camp were in chaos and started running around, shouting something. Knight Nelson, the highest-ranking British commander in the camp, was sweating profusely. He knew that this group of civilians had blown up the camp. As a knight from a knight family, Knight Nelson knew how terrible it was to blow up the camp. In fact, many times, a small army can also achieve great results by attacking the enemy camp in the middle of the night, not by fighting. It is to win by intimidating the opponent and letting the opponent blow up the camp. Once the camp is blown up, the soldiers in the camp are prone to madness. They may run around, or they may attack randomly, blindly looking at anyone in front of them. In such a mess, how can they not be defeated? However, the camp bombing usually occurs in the middle of the night. In broad daylight, the situation can be seen at a glance. Seeing the actual situation, people can calm down quickly, especially regular soldiers. Because they have also received some training. However, these militiamen are different. They have not received any training, let alone the training of the counterattack camp. Faced with the sudden explosion, they were immediately in chaos. Fortunately, this group of militiamen were just coolies transporting grain and had no weapons in their hands. Otherwise, they would really kill each other. Knight Nelson hurriedly commanded his men to appease the chaotic militiamen. But as soon as he sent people to appease the militiamen, there were bursts of horse hooves and neighing of horses in the camp. What's the situation? Are the horses pulling the grain carts frightened? It shouldn't be, those horses are all tied up. Knight Nelson was a little confused. But soon, he knew the reason. But it's better not to know than to know. At this time, his eyes were full of fear, because he saw thousands of people on horseback, waving weapons, rushing into the camp. Obviously, the loud noise just now was caused by this group of people. And it was obvious that the other side was the enemy. Otherwise, they wouldn't have attacked the British camp. Gather! Gather! Come back! Knight Nelson shouted at the top of his lungs, calling on the soldiers who had just been sent out to come closer to him. He knew that if the infantry didn't form a formation in the face of the cavalry, they would definitely die. However, Knight Nelson was surprised to find that the group of cavalry of unknown origin ignored him at all. But soon, Knight Nelson's pupils shrank sharply. Because he saw that the target of this hostile cavalry was not them at all, but the grain storage area. The whole conclusion not only did not make Nelson feel relieved, but made him feel endless fear. As an officer in the English army and responsible for guarding the camp, Nelson knew the purpose of the camp. It was the base camp for His Majesty Henry VII's northern expedition. And those grains and grass were what His Majesty Henry VII was going to feed 15,000 troops and tens of thousands of civilians. After all, the northern counties were in a depression and it was impossible to get food locally. Now, this batch of grain and grass has basically arrived. As long as the spring plowing is over, the British soldiers will arrive at the camp one after another and then start the northern expedition. However, if the grain and grass are lost, it will inevitably affect Henry VII's northern expedition. Knight Nelson can already think of it. If the grain and grass are lost, his head will definitely not be saved. But the 500 spearmen under his command alone are really no match for the thousands of cavalry. However, if the grain and grass are not protected, he will die. So Knight Nelson bit the bullet and took the 500 spearmen who had just lined up, timidly thinking about the grain and grass storage area, hoping to stop the enemy. But the problem is that the civilians in the camp are in chaos. They are running around and blocking the way of the British spearmen. Knight Nelson gritted his teeth and said, "Whoever blocks the way will be killed without mercy." Then, he personally drew his knight's sword and killed a farmer who was blocking the way. Then, his men followed suit, holding up their spears and stabbing all the civilians who were blocking the way. But they were still a little late. The British camp was built very large. After all, it was to accommodate 20,000 to 30,000 people. Originally, there were also civilians running around on the road where the horse thieves were heading to the grain and grass storage area. However, the horse bandits were riding horses and were very flexible. Under the command of Coster and Merrick, 900 horse bandits bypassed the civilian residential area and rushed directly to the grain and grass storage area in the empty camp. After arriving at the grain and grass storage area, Coster and Merrick divided the horse bandits into several teams. Each team was responsible for several grain and grass piles. "Throw the sheep oil cans up, just like me," Coster commanded loudly. Then, he took the lead and smashed the pottery mutton oil can in his hand against the grain pile. With a clang sound, the pottery can broke, and the mutton oil spilled on the grain pile. Then, Coster took out the oil paper bag, sprinkled some gunpowder powder on the grain pile, and then threw a lit matchlock on it. After a puff sound, green smoke came out of the grain pile, and then the whole grain pile was set on fire. Because of the mutton oil, the fire started quickly. "Everyone come and light the torches," Merrick shouted loudly. Then, he took out a wooden stick with a rag tied to the top. After stirring the stick in the mutton oil can, Merrick directly put one end of the rag dipped in mutton oil on the burning hay pile and set it on fire. In this way, a torch was quickly formed. The bandits under him followed suit and lit the torches they had prepared long ago. After arriving at their respective contracted areas, these bandits followed suit and smashed their mutton oil cans hard at the hay pile, with clang sounds everywhere. Then, they put the torches against the parts that were dipped in mutton oil, and then the hay pile quickly caught fire. Of course, the mutton oil was mainly used for the grain pile. As for the hay pile prepared for the horses, there was no need to add oil at all. As long as the torch was extended over and lit, the hay pile would burn vigorously. Chapter 644, The French are caught in the crossfire again. No, Knight Nelson screamed heartbreakingly as he watched the flames rising from the grain storage area. Originally, he had hoped that this group of cavalrymen of unknown origin were just bandits who came to rob food. In this way, this group of people, at most 1,000 people, could not take away much food even if they robbed food. But unexpectedly, this group of bastards came to burn the grain. You bastards, curse you! I curse you all to hell! Knight Nelson shouted frantically. He knew that he was finished. He would definitely be executed for failing to protect the grain for 20,000 to 30,000 people. Even if the grain was not saved, it was also due to insufficient troops, and Henry VII himself had to bear a great responsibility. However, Henry VII was the king, and the king was not wrong, so he was the only one who could take the blame. So, he was doomed. Knight Nelson went crazy. He swung his knight's sword vigorously, slashing and killing any civilians on the road leading to the grain storage area, shouting loudly. Kill, kill! Kill all of you untouchables who are blocking the road. Knight Nelson went completely crazy. He knew that he could not escape death after the grain was burned. However, if he survived, he would not only be executed, but also his family's knighthood and land would be taken back, and he would become a civilian family from then on. Now, Knight Nelson had only one way to go, to die in battle. Only by dying in battle could he avoid the humiliation of being executed. At the same time, the king might let his family go because of his brave death. As long as he died in battle, there would be no dirty water thrown on him, such as fearing the battle and running away in the face of the enemy. In the end, everyone will understand that it is the lack of troops, not Knight Nelson's responsibility. In this way, the Nelson family's wealth and honor may still be preserved. If they are sentenced to death, the Nelson family will be disgraced, and there is a great possibility that they will be removed from the nobility, and will bear the shame for generations. Therefore, Knight Nelson no longer considers winning or losing at this time, and is determined to die. If he is not afraid of death, who can stop him? Under the crazy slashing of Knight Nelson, the civilians who were originally running around like headless flies gradually calmed down. After all, it was dawn, and as long as they calmed down, they could see the situation around them clearly. Unlike the night, they could not see clearly at all and could only continue to be chaotic. The calm civilians were shocked and they saw Knight Nelson, who looked like a madman and chopped anyone he saw. After regaining their sanity, they made way. Knight Nelson took the opportunity to rush to the horse bandits who were setting fire. And his 500 spearmen also hurriedly followed up and rushed to the grain and grass storage area together. The adjutant shouted loudly, reminding Knight Nelson to return to the command of his team. But Knight Nelson was now seeking to die in battle, so how could he listen to him? Therefore, the adjutant could only helplessly watch Knight Nelson rushing towards the bandits alone, while he commanded 500 spearmen to follow up quickly. The British Army's movement attracted the attention of Coster and Merrick. Seeing 500 British spearmen rushing over, Coster frowned. He didn't expect the British Army to dare to launch an attack. You know, the reason why Coster dared to let everyone light torches leisurely after entering the camp was that he calculated that the enemy was infantry without archers, and they only dared to form a formation to protect themselves, and did not dare to take the initiative to attack. But now, the other side actually dared to take the initiative to charge. This script is wrong. However, he didn't have time to sigh, but ordered his archer captain. Lister, you take the archers to intercept them, don't let them interfere with our burning of food and grass. So, the archer captain named Lister took more than 300 archers to intercept those British spearmen. As a horse archer, it is obviously unnecessary to attack the spearmen head-on. This is not the first time that they have encountered infantry. Lister skillfully commanded the horse archers to divide into 200 groups, outflanking from the flank and shooting arrows at the British spearmen from the side. For a time, arrows rained down, and the British soldiers in the formation screamed from time to time. You know, as the lowest level soldiers, most of the spearmen did not even have leather armor, only officers had armor. Therefore, more than 300 horse archers brought huge casualties to the 500 English spearmen. The screams when they were hit by arrows from time to time greatly reduced the morale of the British Army. But there was one person who was not affected at all. That was Knight Nelson. As a knight, Nelson certainly had a set of plate armor. Originally, Knight Nelson also had a warhorse. Unfortunately, the loud explosion just now scared his horse. So, he could only lead his troops to fight on foot. At this moment, he directly wore plate armor and charged at the horse bandits. Moreover, the speed was not slow. After all, as a professional knight, he has practiced. Although the arrows of the horse archers rained down, they were only effective against the spearmen who were not wearing plate armor. Facing Nelson wearing plate armor, it was useless. The British spearmen were suppressed by the horse archers, and the charge slowed down. But Knight Nelson still rushed towards the horse bandits at full speed. Although he wanted to die, Knight Nelson still planned to drag a few people with him. Seeing that Knight Nelson wearing plate armor was not afraid of bows and arrows, Merrick, who was roaming the battle formation, frowned. After thinking for a while, Merrick fumbled in the backpack on his warhorse for a while and took out a clockwork flint pistol. The ammunition of the gun was already loaded and pressed, and the spring was also wound. As long as the trigger was pulled and the spring was released, it could be fired at any time. Under normal circumstances, Merrick would never take out this gun. Because this was his last trump card. Moreover, if a clockwork flint gun was used, it would be easy for Henry VII to suspect Marin. Because Marin's Black Knights were the first army in Europe to be equipped with clockwork flintlock carbines on a large scale. Therefore, Merrick usually wouldn't use this clockwork flintlock unless there was an emergency. But now, Merrick couldn't care less. Anyway, Marin would lead the army to attack Henry VII next month. At this time, even if people knew that he used a clockwork flintlock, no one would have time to care. After seeing Knight Nelson about to rush to the horse bandit, Merrick took out the clockwork flintlock without hesitation, turned on the simple safety, actually a simple clip that stuck the spring and prevented it from loosening, and aimed at Knight Nelson who was within 30 meters. For safety, Merrick only aimed at first and didn't fire. When Knight Nelson approached about 15 meters, Merrick felt confident, then he pulled the trigger and released the spring. After a brief friction sound, a gunshot rang out, and Knight Nelson was injured and fell to the ground. The impact of the bullet injured Knight Nelson, but it was not fatal, after all, he was wearing plate armor. However, Knight Nelson temporarily lost his combat effectiveness, and he felt pain all over his body when he moved, his bones were broken. In line with the principle of taking advantage of your illness to kill you, Merrick took a can of sheep oil from his horse thief, which had not yet been thrown out, and smashed it hard at the injured Knight Nelson after approaching. The pottery pot naturally broke when it hit the plate armor, and the sheep oil flowed out. Merrick waved his hand, and soon, Lister had people light arrows, made some rockets, and shot them at Knight Nelson lying on the ground. Those English spearmen who didn't have time to catch up watched their chief officer Knight Nelson being engulfed by flames. There was even the aroma of barbecue accompanied by a burnt smell. The English spearmen collapsed immediately after their commander was killed, and the more than 300 horse archers were still shooting them hard, so many English spearmen turned around and ran away. The adjutant wanted to stop them, but he was shot and fell to the ground. When the English civilians saw this, they also ran away. Soon, only the bandits who set the fire were left in the camp. The bandits were too lazy to chase them and were busy setting the fire. When the fire was almost over, Coster and Merrick gathered the team to leave. However, before leaving, Coster deliberately fell behind, and then, at the section of the fence that was blown up in the camp, he deliberately dropped a beautiful silk purse. This was not an ordinary purse, because the purse contained some French silver coins and 2 French letters. It was obvious that Marin's old habit of framing others had come back again. And this time, the French were still the ones who were shot. Chapter 645, Half True, Half False Information. As expected, after hearing the news, the garrison in Birmingham City rushed over and found the silk purse at the gap in the fence where the horse bandits entered and exited. After all, the purse was dropped near the exit, and the silk was so bright. The garrison found it easily as soon as they entered the door. Originally, Baron Jurgen, the commander of the Birmingham garrison, intended to steal the purse, but after opening the purse, he found 2 French letters and immediately gave up the idea. According to the intelligence obtained, the attack on the camp should be a group of horse thieves. However, there were 2 French letters and some French coins in the purse dropped by the horse thieves. Baron Jurgen knew that something was wrong. He was one of Henry VII's confidants, and he quickly handed the purse to Henry VII. Moreover, he added his own judgment. This group of horse thieves was probably secretly supported by the French in order to cause trouble for England. Baron Jürgen did not understand French, but Henry VII did. Before the rebellion, Henry VII had been wandering in the Duchy of Brittany in France for a long time and was not unfamiliar with French. After opening the two letters, Henry VII found that one of the two letters was a family letter written by a French woman named Jean to her husband Henry. It was mainly some caring words and reporting to the other party that everything was fine at home. The second letter was very important. This letter was written by Count d'Ette, who was in charge of intelligence in France, to a knight named Henry Spajo. The content of the letter made Henry VII terrified. In this letter, Count d'Ette said that he had received intelligence from London that the British Army had built a base camp in Warwickshire, which might be used to deal with the bandit groups in several counties in the central region. Therefore, Count d'Ette ordered this knight named Henry Spajo to lead the horse bandits of his Robin Hood bandit group to take advantage of the fact that the British soldiers were busy with spring ploughing and had not yet assembled, and first destroyed the British camp and burned the enemy's food and grass to disrupt their actions. This paragraph clearly explains why the British camp was attacked. Of course, this is not the point, nor is it what frightened Henry VII. The following part frightened Henry VII. The letter goes on to say that the great French King Louis decided to take advantage of the civil strife in England to conquer the Kingdom of England and end the century-old feud between France and England. The specific plan was to send a fleet to raid the British fleet in the Irish Sea and help Edward land in England. Of course, this was just a diversionary tactic. The real intention of the French was to use the conflict in the Irish Sea to attract most of the English ships and weaken the maritime defense of the English Channel. When the British fleet was attracted by the conflict in the Irish Sea, the French would suddenly launch a large-scale landing operation and break through London in one fell swoop. Done. As for Edward, his life or death has nothing to do with the French, but it can fully attract the attention and main forces of the British. And this knight named Henry Spajo, his mission is to lead the horse bandits to find faults with the British Army, specifically attack their supply lines, and weaken the British Army's combat effectiveness to a certain extent. When the British Army put all its attention on Edward and the bandit group in the middle, the French launched a large-scale landing war and took England in one fell swoop. Even in the letter, Count d'Ette proudly stated that they had used several fake chambers of commerce to trick most of the large merchant ships that could be used as warships and a large number of experienced sailors of the Five Ports Alliance out to sea. As long as the French army launched an attack before those large ships returned, Britain would be doomed. Seeing this, Henry VII was sweating profusely. If there was only this letter, Henry VII might be suspicious. But Marin was too cunning. He specially used the wallet as a prop, and added some French silver coins and a family letter to make everything look so reasonable. If it was just the second letter, Henry VII might suspect that the enemy wanted to pass on wrong information to him and deliberately mislead him. But with the family letter, it seems more reasonable. Because no one would send their family letters to the enemy. Marin took advantage of the fixed thinking mode of Europeans in this era, set up a clever scheme, and used a wallet containing family letters and French silver coins to dispel Henry VII's initial doubts. Henry VII has already made up a complete storyline in his mind. A French knight named Henry Spajo, under the instigation of the French intelligence chief Count d'Ette, took advantage of the chaos in northern and central England and came to the Song of Sherwood Forest in Nottinghamshire, where the thief Robin Hood had been active. He used the alias Robinson and pulled up a bandit team from the wandering victims, specializing in sabotage, making England restless. And it seems that they succeeded. But this bandit group will not bring a fatal threat to England. The real threat is what the letter said about using the conflict in the Irish Sea and Edward's power to attract the main force of the English navy to facilitate the crossing of the French army. Of course, there is also the fact that the French hired the large merchant ships of the Five Ports Alliance at a high price. These are the most fatal. After all, in the eyes of Henry VII, although Edward's army looks large, its combat effectiveness is just as so. Even if all of them cross the sea, they can't beat the English army. The biggest threat to Britain is still the French. The French army is very powerful. After the late period of the 100 Years' War, the British army is no match for the French army. Otherwise, the King of England would not have lost all French territories except the Calais fortress. Moreover, the French army is large enough to dispatch tens of thousands of troops to fight a national war. Unlike Edward, there are only about 10,000 people at most, which is not a big deal. And if the French army successfully lands in England, the British army will be in trouble, and it is not impossible that the country will be destroyed. Before, the British relied on civilian merchant ships and experienced sailors to successfully repel the French invasion time and time again, and even turned the tables and invaded the northern coast of France. The French navy is not strong, not only because of their own lack of attention, but also because of the British raids. Now, if the main force of the British navy is attracted to the Irish Sea, and the large ships of the Cinque Ports are also lured away, it seems that the English Channel really can't stop the French landing. Henry VII hurriedly sent people to the ports of the Cinque Ports to verify. At this time, the branches of the so-called Dutch and Italian chambers of commerce had been deserted under Marin's notice. The people sent by Henry VII only found some French supplies and French-language papers. After hearing that most of the merchant ships of the Five Ports Alliance were really hired at high prices to go to sea, Henry VII had to believe the content of the letter: the French were really going to attack England. So, Henry VII immediately sent a large number of speedboats to chase in the direction of Italy and the Baltic Sea, and ordered those merchant ships of the Five Ports Alliance to return home to prepare for war to stop the French invasion at sea. In addition, Henry VII also specially summoned small boats and experienced sailors from various ports to let them join the war. However, Henry VII was also a shrewd man. After knowing that the French might cross the English Channel, he guessed that the French would definitely send ships to scout. Therefore, he did not immediately order all the small boats to rush to the English Channel, but ordered them to wait for orders at the ports on the southeast coast and southwest coast of England. Then, Henry VII sent many small fishing boats to scout in the English Channel. Once the French reconnaissance ship was found coming, he would report to the British court. If the reconnaissance ship sent by the French turned back, Henry VII would immediately order all ships of all sizes to gather along the southern coast of England and wait for the arrival of the French fleet. This time, Henry VII decided to annihilate the French fleet and teach the French a fatal lesson. Little did he know that all this fell into Marin's calculations. The reason why Marin wrote this letter was to specifically pit France. England wanted to annex, but France was a greater threat. If the French were really allowed to land in England, a war would be inevitable. The French might not have much to do with England across the sea, but they had plenty of ways to deal with the North Sea Grand Duchy, which was also on the European continent. This was proved by the tragic ending of the Netherlands in history. In the Anglo-Dutch War, it was by uniting with France that Britain finally won over the Dutch by taking down the Dutch native nest on land. Therefore, it was best to drive the British to deal with the French. Originally, Marin planned to pass the message through the spy in England in the French palace. However, since Coster was going to attack the British camp in advance, it would be better to let Coster do it. After all, the more the British prepare in advance, the more fully prepared they are, and the higher the success rate of defeating the French fleet will be. Moreover, when England knows the so-called truth, that the battle in the Irish Sea is just to attract the attention of the main force of the English navy, it will not desperately send ships to stop Edward. After all, in the letter, the French believe that Edward is just a pawn to attract Henry VII's English army. Moreover, Henry VII also has an idea: since Edward is hiding on the island of Ireland and can't do anything to him, why not put Edward in the mainland of England and then annihilate him in one fell swoop? You know, that fake Richard was finished like this. Henry VII believes that as long as he resists the landing of the French, then he will turn around and clean up Edward's little family assets, and he will not smile. It's okay for him to hide on the island of Ireland, but he dares to return to the mainland of England, which is simply seeking his own death. And Marin's half-true and half-false intelligence is to make Henry VII focus all his attention on the French. Then, when blocking Edward from landing, they deliberately let him go. In this way, if the French want to land, they will hit the iron plate directly. The fully mobilized English navy is still very powerful. It is precisely because the content of this intelligence is half true and half false, and the true part can be confirmed. Therefore, Henry VII believed the authenticity of this intelligence. Otherwise, the wily Henry VII is not so easy to deceive. It is true that the French want to invade England. This can also be verified by British spies in France. It is also true that the big ships of the Five Ports Alliance were deceived overseas. Marin just threw the pot of the deceiver to the French. In order to pit the French, Marin even revealed to Henry VII the news that he was going to launch a feint attack in the Irish Sea. With Marin's understanding of Henry VII, the old fox, the other party is likely to play tricks and let Edward land in England. That's because Henry VII didn't know that he had quietly landed 20,000 troops in Newcastle. In his previous life, Marin had heard such a saying: a lie that was 7 points true and 3 points false was the easiest to deceive people. Although the false information provided by Marin to Henry VII was not 70% true, it was also half true. In 16th century Europe, where schemes were not popular, this half-true and half-false information was enough to fool people, even a man as strategic as Henry VII. Because, limited by the background of the times, he had never seen a clever deception. A half-true and half-false information was enough to make Henry VII fall into the trap. Chapter 646, Henry VII's Plan. In fact, Marin's half-true and half-false intelligence has loopholes. Because, as a confidant of King Louis XII of France, it is not reasonable for Count d'Ette to reveal a detailed battle plan to a knight sent out as a spy. Fortunately, Henry VII also knew that Count d'Ette was a person who rose to prominence by flattering, and he himself did not have much talent. It is not impossible for such a person to do something unreliable. Moreover, in order to show the unreliability of Count d'Ette, Marin used a triumphant and boastful tone when forging the letter, and briefly described the French plan, which was not particularly detailed. This is also in line with the character of Count d'Ette, and it seems to be revealed unintentionally. However, Marin is still a little worried. After all, if it were in the Ming dynasty of the same period, this trick would be extremely easy to expose. After all, since the spring and autumn period and the Warring States period, conspiracies and intrigues have been carried forward in China. In the Ming dynasty, if you don't understand conspiracies and intrigues, you can't gain a foothold in the court. Fortunately, the Church has dominated Europe for hundreds of years and imprisoned the thoughts of Europeans. Therefore, Europeans are not good at conspiracies and intrigues now. Therefore, Marin finally decided to take a gamble, betting that Henry VII could not see the loopholes here. In the end, Marin's gamble succeeded. Henry VII was also a little skeptical at first, but after sending people to investigate the port of the Five Ports Alliance and finding that the big ships there were indeed deceived to go out to sea, he had to believe the authenticity of this intelligence. What finally made Henry VII no longer doubt was the intelligence from France. Britain and France have been at odds for more than 100 years, and they have deeply infiltrated each other. In northern France, there are many spies sent by the British. Recently, the spies suddenly discovered that some remote ports in northern France suddenly had a lot of ships. This is not the most important thing. The most important thing is that these ships seem to come from the south. Where is the south of France? The Mediterranean coast. Ports such as Marseille and Toulon. British spies lurking along the northern coast of France found that many ships from the south had docked at some inconspicuous ports in northern France. They felt that something was wrong, so they rowed a small boat out to sea at night and rushed to the British-controlled Channel Islands near the French coast to report the situation. The British garrison commander in the Channel Islands also felt unusual, so he sent a ship back to London to report the situation. Henry VII had originally received accurate information from 5 ports that most of the large ships had been deceived into going out to sea. Now, he found that the French had actually gathered all the ships in the Mediterranean region to the northern coastal ports. If he didn't understand what the French wanted to do, Henry VII could buy a piece of tofu and hit himself to death. So, Henry VII no longer doubted the authenticity of this information at this time. At the same time, he also began to prepare for war. In order to fight against the French, Henry VII decided to concentrate his forces first and destroy the French fleet at sea. As for Edward, he ignored it for the time being and indulged him to land. After the French fleet was destroyed, the main force of the British Navy went to the Irish Sea, blocked this sea area, and cut off Edward's retreat back to the island of Ireland. Finally, the British army marched north again to wipe out Edward's forces in one fell swoop. At the same time, they also surrounded Sherwood Forest and completely wiped out the Robin Hood thieves, led by the French knight Spajo. In fact, all these arrangements made by Henry VII were correct. Of course, the premise is that Marin did not get involved. If Marin had not intervened, Henry VII would have been able to eliminate the French navy and completely eliminate Edward with these arrangements. However, Henry VII did not expect that a German prince who seemed to have nothing to do with England would reach out to England. Under Henry VII's deliberate arrangement, the English navy deliberately reduced the number of British warships in the Irish Sea. Moreover, Henry VII recalled all the larger warships, leaving only some small and medium-sized dilapidated warships, deliberately leaving them for the so-called French navy to destroy. At present, the real main force of the navy, except for those large ships that were deceived, is mostly hidden in the estuaries along the coast of southeast England. Henry VII studied the map of France and believed that the most likely location for the French to launch an attack was unlikely to be in the port of Calais, which is closest to Britain. Because there are too many British spies here. So it is not easy to keep it secret. It is also unlikely to be on the west side of the Normandy Peninsula, because there are the Channel Islands controlled by the British, which closely monitor the French coastline. Therefore, the location where the French launched the attack is likely to be on the coastline from Calais port to the east of the Normandy Peninsula. Moreover, the intelligence sent back from France also shows that the French did start hiding ships in the bay east of the Normandy Peninsula. For example, near Caen in the southeast of the Normandy Peninsula, the French hid a lot of ships. Caen is not a seaport, but it is connected to the sea through the Orne River and is an important trade river port. In today's situation where ships are generally small, inland ports like Caen with large rivers connecting to the sea are the mainstream. For example, the British capital London is actually an important inland port connected to the sea by the Thames River. Hiding the ships transferred from the south in the Orne River is indeed difficult for the British patrol boats in the channel to find. However, this was discovered by the British spies planted in Caen. Of course, under normal circumstances, even if the British found that southern ships had come to northern France, they would not care too much. Why? Because the British looked down on the French navy. It's not like France had never attacked Britain from the sea, but each time it was defeated. If it weren't for the half-true and half-false intelligence provided by Marin, the British might have discovered that the French hid their ships, but they wouldn't have paid much attention. After all, the British despised the French in naval battles. In addition, a fishing village called Le Havre at the mouth of the Seine, not far east of the mouth of the Orne River, has long attracted the attention of the French government. The Seine is the most important inland river in France because it connects the French capital Paris and the sea. Some people in the French court have proposed to build a port here. In fact, France did build a port here in 1517. Today, France has also hidden a group of ships from the south in Le Havre, a fishing village at the mouth of the Seine. Various intelligence indicates that the French will probably launch a general attack on England in some inconspicuous small ports on the coastline between Calais and the Normandy Islands. Henry VII is not a vegetarian either. He plans to completely eliminate the little assets of the French navy through this naval battle. Therefore, he ordered that most of the large ships in the country be hidden in the river bays on the southeast coast so as not to scare France. If the French do not initiate a sea crossing, how can he destroy the main force of the French fleet? But these arrangements of Henry VII were seen by the spies of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce branch in London and the intelligence agency of Princess Margaret sent by Marin. Soon, this information was sent to Marin's desk. What? Henry VII hid many ships in the river bays on the southeast coast. Is this the rhythm of ambush on the French fleet? Marin thought about it, and then laughed. Ha ha ha, it seems that the false intelligence worked. Henry VII is going to completely destroy the French navy. This is great. After laughing, Marin began to think. Well, it seems that we have to change the plan. In order to let Henry VII deal with the French with peace of mind, we have to delay the time of action. Chapter 647, Fleet Departure. Although he knew that Henry VII was going to play tricks on France, Marin didn't know that Henry VII was also going to put Edward in England to fight. Therefore, Marin still followed the original plan and sent a fleet to destroy the British warships in the Irish Sea. And Marin himself began to set off and boarded the warship to Newcastle. At present, spring ploughing has basically ended. Because there are sufficient oxen, the spring ploughing in the Grand Duchy of the North Sea ended very early. If it were normal, Marin might arrange for people to go to the newly controlled provinces of West Frisia, Bremen and Jutland to reclaim more land. But now, because of the attack on England, Marin can't take care of it. While Marin was boarding the ship, a fleet sailed westward at the same time to attack English ships in the Irish Sea. When approaching the narrowest Calais Strait between England and France, the fleet commander Kidd, following Marin's order, deliberately sailed close to France. Moreover, there was no flag. The French did not stop it, because the French navy had long received news that a fleet from the German Grand Duchy of the North Sea would pass through here. The British also discovered this fleet. However, because the fleet was obviously close to the French side and did not hang a flag to indicate its identity, the British mistakenly thought that this fleet was French. After all, if it were not a French fleet, the French would definitely intercept it. The fleet stuck to the French side and headed west. After crossing the Normandy Peninsula, the fleet suddenly raised the flag collectively, which was the white rose flag representing the York family. Britain had experienced a 30-year-long war of red and white roses. The red rose was the symbol of the Lancaster family. The white rose is the symbol of the York family. In fact, Henry VII was not a direct descendant of the Lancaster family, but a branch of the Tudor family. It was only because the Lancaster family had no male direct members that Henry VII, a foreign relative, became the head of the Lancaster family. After seizing the throne in 1485, Henry VII married Princess Elizabeth of the York family, integrated the Lancaster family and the York family, and used the red and white rose with red and white as the family emblem to indicate that the Lancaster family and the York family were combined into one. However, Edward obviously didn't think so. He believed that the York family was violently annexed by Henry VII. As the only male descendant of the York family and the former crown prince, Richard III appointed Edward as the crown prince after his son died. It was necessary to revive the York family. Therefore, the flags of his army were all white roses. Kidd's fleet flew the white rose flag, which obviously indicated that it would serve Edward. However, in the Tudor dynasty of Henry VII, flying the white rose flag was absolutely treasonous and a rebellion. But strangely, after flying the white rose flag, Kidd's fleet had a smooth journey. After waiting for a long time, there was no English ship to chase. It's just as the Grand Duke expected. Kidd breathed a sigh of relief. Before, Marin had explained that when passing through the Channel Islands west of the Normandy Peninsula, he deliberately flew the white rose flag to provoke the British. Because there is a British fleet in the Channel Islands. In this way, the attitude of the British can also be tested. If the British sent out all their ships to chase Kidd and his men, it would indicate that Marin had made a wrong judgment, and the naval battle in the Irish Sea might be more difficult. If the other side ignored it, it would indicate that Henry VII was indeed preparing to ambush the French fleet. In this way, the British would be very restrained at this time and would not encircle and annihilate his fleet. Even the British would be very restrained in the naval battle in the Irish Sea. As expected by Marin, the British fleet in the Channel Islands was very restrained this time. After hearing his men report that a fleet from France had flown the white rose flag, Fleet Commander Hunter laughed and said, "Your Majesty is wise, the French really want to attract us to chase this fleet. Well, I have to express it, otherwise it's too fake." Then, a dozen small fishing boats were sent out of Guernsey, pretending to chase Kidd's fleet for a while. However, Kidd's fleet at that time had 3,200-ton carracks equipped with many bronze cannons. In order to keep it secret, Marin did not use his own distinctive warships and armed merchant ships, but used carracks that he had bought from Spain. Anyway, it is not surprising that the French used Spanish ship types. After all, France and Spain border each other, and carracks are also used more frequently in the Mediterranean coastal areas of southern France. The pursuit of the dozen or so small fishing boats sent by Hunter looked like a suicide mission. In fact, the fishing boats pretending to pursue were really fishing boats, and the people on the boats were ordinary fishermen. They were forced to chase Kidd's fleet. Even if they were destroyed, Commander Hunter would not feel bad. However, Kidd did not turn back to destroy the other party, but continued to follow the script, first commanding the fleet to turn north, turn to the coastal side of England, and then slowly head west, walking and stopping, as if waiting for someone. It seems that this is specifically designed to irritate the English navy and lure the enemy to chase and kill. The local English troops on the coast rushed this news to London. It's true. They actually want to lure us to chase and kill, they really want to divert the main force of the English navy. Then, Henry VII issued an order. Send more slow boats to pretend to chase for a while, and deliberately not catch up. Henry VII was also afraid that the other party would see his intention, so he planned to send some small boats to pretend to chase. Anyway, the big ships of England were probably bought out to sea by the French. At this time, it was reasonable to send some small boats to chase. This made France feel more at ease. So, the fleet led by Kidd, under the escort of a large group of English small boats, headed for the Irish Sea in a mighty manner. However, that large group of small boats seemed to be deliberately unable to catch up, and from time to time there were small boats left behind. At this time, Kidd took out the script given by Marin again, and according to the instructions of the script, he timely separated a carrack sailboat and sailed to the French coast. The reason for this was to show it to the British. You see, we sent a ship back home to report the effect. It seems that it really attracted a lot of British ships to chase. Seeing that the French fleet separated a ship to return home to report the news, the commander of the British Navy, Wallace, did not separate ships to intercept, but laughed, revealing a smile of success. At this time, a strong wind blew from the West Sea. The small English boats sent to chase seemed too small, and were swayed left and right by the strong westerly wind. Even a small fishing boat was blown over. Suddenly, the British fleet was in a panic. Wallace, who was in charge of the team, had an idea and took all the small fishing boats to the shore to avoid the wind. In this way, they had a reason to stop chasing. You see, there was a strong wind, and the small boats couldn't bear it. Seeing that the English fleet stopped chasing, the leading French fleet seemed anxious and stopped to wait for the British fleet to continue chasing, but Wallace ignored them. In desperation, Captain Kidd had to lead the fleet to continue to sail slowly towards the Irish Sea. Chapter 648, A Tacit Naval Battle. After Captain Kidd led the fleet into the Irish Sea, he immediately changed his style and began to search for British ships in a swift and resolute manner, sinking them directly when he saw them. But what was unexpected and expected to Kidd was that there was almost no big warship in the Irish Sea at this time, only some dilapidated warships. How can you tell that it was a warship? Because the ship was flying the St. George's Cross flag representing England and the red and white rose flag representing the Tudor family at the same time. The two flags were hung together, representing the Tudor royal family's domination of England. Because Edward had not yet occupied England, his army only hung the white rose flag, and could not hang the St. George's Cross flag representing England. But these two flags were hung on those big warships of more than 200 tons, but hanging them on the dilapidated small boats, why did it look wrong? However, Kidd didn't care whether those small boats were real warships, but directly opened fire. Henry VII was originally trying to confuse his opponents this time, so he was also prepared to have a few ships sunk. Therefore, the small boats sent over were not only small, but also old and worn out, and many of them were basically on the verge of falling apart. For these broken ships, the general way to dispose of them was to dismantle them directly. Useful wood was left to continue shipbuilding. For example, some of the internal wood was rarely corroded and worn out, and could be recycled, and useless broken boards were directly dismantled and used as firewood. And this time, in order to confuse the French, the ships that Henry VII put on the Irish Sea were almost all old ships ready to be dismantled. The keels of many ships were eaten away by sea maggots or termites, and they were about to fall apart. Generally speaking, only when the keel was damaged would such a ship be eliminated. Because if other parts were broken, the worst that could happen was to replace a piece of wood. But the damage to the keel was very serious, and it was easy to fall apart during sailing, so it had to be dismantled. Therefore, the old ships sent by Henry VII this time were basically broken ships with keels eaten away. Even though Captain Kidd's fleet this time used Spanish carracks, and the caliber of the guns was not large, it was very easy to achieve success when encountering such a ship that was about to fall apart. In a few days, more than a dozen British warships were sunk in the Irish Sea. Then, British ships were rarely seen in the Irish Sea. At this time, the carrack that had originally went to France to report the news also turned back. Of course, this ship was not going to France to report the news, but to the mouth of the Shannon River in the southwest of the island of Ireland to guide a group of cargo ships. These cargo ships were arranged there by Marin before, ready to be used to transport Edward's soldiers. In order not to be noticed by the British, these ships specially arrived in batches at the mouth of the Shannon River under Edward's control in the southwest of the island of Ireland, and waited there. Now, this ship went over and brought over the 3,200-ton cogs anchored at the mouth of the Shannon River. Seeing that there were almost no British warships in the Irish Sea, Captain Kidd divided 10 warships to escort the 30 cogs north to transport Edward's army. Captain Kidd himself took the remaining 20 warships to Plymouth Harbour on the Cornwall Peninsula where the English fleet temporarily docked, deliberately provoking. Since it's a play, it has to be played in full. Marin's script is to let Kidd and his fleet pretend to be French and deliberately seduce the British Navy to pursue. However, Wallace, the British commander who was hiding in Plymouth Harbour, ignored it. In fact, Wallace couldn't care even if he wanted to. Because the real fleet was hidden on the southeast coast. Only a few ships in the fleet he brought were truly in the battle sequence. The other ships were fishing boats and small merchant ships, which were not vulnerable at all. Therefore, Wallace could only ignore Kidd's provocation. At this time, Henry VII also carried out large-scale tactical fraud. In order to give the French the illusion that his evil plan succeeded, Henry VII specially found a lot of larger fishing boats to form a huge scale of hundreds of ships. Then, this fleet, from the southeast coast of England, passed through the narrow Strait of Calais, deliberately letting the French see it. The Strait of Calais is only 30 kilometers wide, and the British fleet is sailing in the middle of the strait. Even with the naked eye, the French can see that Britain has indeed dispatched a large number of ships to the west. Of course, the French can only see with the naked eye because they don't have a telescope. After swaggering through the Strait of Calais, this fleet, composed of hundreds of large fishing boats, continued to go west in the center of the English Channel. It seems that this fleet really went to support the battlefield in the Irish Sea. After listening to the report of the coastal garrison, Louis XII also concluded that this British fleet was indeed going to hunt down the fleet of the Grand Duchy of the North Sea. Although there were no big ships, so many medium-sized warships were enough to give Marin's fleet a hard time. However, for Louis XII, it was none of his business whether Marin's fleet was good or not. It would be best if Marin's fleet and the British fleet fought to a draw. At that time, the French would just come out to clean up the mess. A few days later, this fleet arrived at Plymouth Harbor, where the fleet led by Wallace was docked, and joined it. Captain Kidd's fleet, which was provocative outside Plymouth Harbor, saw hundreds of ships coming to support, and was scared to immediately withdraw to the Irish Sea in the west. But strangely, this fleet that came to reinforce did not pursue, but also docked at Plymouth Harbor, and then everyone on the ship disembarked. Captain Kidd knew it in his heart because Marin's script told him that this fleet might be fake. The so-called naval battle between the two sides was also a strange naval battle full of tacit understanding. Because he was worried, Captain Kidd specially sent 3 ships to provoke. As a result, the British ignored it. Now, Captain Kidd was finally relieved this fleet was indeed fake. Otherwise, they would have chased them out long ago. Then, Captain Kidd left only 4 ships to monitor the movements of the British near the Cornwall Peninsula. And he himself took the main force north to escort the transportation of Edward's army. If there were fans in later generations who saw this strange naval battle, they would definitely snore, "Isn't this a match fixing?" Yes, it really looks like a match fixing in later football. From beginning to end, when it started, Kidd's fleet sank more than a dozen small broken ships that were about to fall apart in the Irish Sea. Then, there was no real battle between the fleets of both sides. The confrontation near Plymouth Harbor was more like a test and deception of each other. However, both sides were very proud. The British thought they had deceived the French, while Kidd knew that they had indeed deceived the British. Of course, the British were not wrong to think that they had deceived the French. Because the real French were indeed confused by the British's actions. But in fact, Kidd's fleet was not French at all, but from the Grand Duchy of the North Sea of Germany. So, in this tacit, naval battle, that was similar to a match fixing, both sides were very satisfied and thought they had deceived the other side. Of course, one side really deceived the other side, while the other side thought it had deceived the other side. Chapter 649, Let Edward play by himself for a while. In this tacit naval battle similar to a match fixing, both sides are winners. However, England is the current winner, while the Grand Duchy of the North Sea is the future winner. Only France really thought that the Grand Duchy of the North Sea would send out a fleet to fight England to the death. As if afraid that Marin's fleet would fail, Louis XII sent someone to Auric to remind Marin that the British had too many ships, so do you want to add some more ships? But at this time, Marin had already set off for Newcastle, and Louis XII's messenger certainly couldn't find Marin. The palace Prime Minister Geoffrey, who was in charge of the reception, fooled the French envoy and said, "We sent 35 warships before, bypassing the north of Scotland from the North Sea, and had already ambushed in the north of the Irish Sea. So, we won't lose." The French believed it, but after the waiter went back, the French were a little worried, so they wanted to send 1 or 2 small boats to the Irish Sea to see the situation of the war. But at this time, Wallace, the British naval officer in charge of Plymouth Harbor, did not allow the French ship to approach. Although he could not defeat the 30 regular warships led by Kidd, Wallace, who had many ships, could still intercept one or two French spy ships. Spy ships are not warships. They are small and have no special naval personnel. Once the ship sent by Wallace was intercepted, it had to turn back. Therefore, the French spy ship failed to find out the specific news. The reason why Wallace sent people to intercept the French spy ship was that he was afraid that the intelligence would be transmitted back to France, which would make the French upper class feel something was wrong. The British looked down on the French navy, but they could not look down on the wisdom of the French high level. Louis XII was not stupid. If he knew that there was no naval battle at sea, he might see something. Therefore, Wallace's order was not to fight with the previous French fleet. But at the same time, the reconnaissance ships from the French mainland must not be allowed to approach the Irish Sea. The fishing boats he led could do this. After all, there were a few real warships in it, but they were a little smaller. It may not be possible to deal with large warships, but it is still possible to drive away the small French spy ships. The British believe that what happened in the Irish Sea will definitely arouse the suspicion of the French fleet. Therefore, they may send ships back to report these strange situations. Therefore, although most of the ships brought by Wallace were fishing boats forcibly requisitioned by civilians, there were also a small number of small and medium-sized warships, about a dozen. These ships would definitely not be able to confront the 30 Clark warships head-on, but they could still intercept the French ships that reported the news and reconnaissance boats. As long as the French mainland does not receive abnormal news from the Irish Sea, the French will launch an attack on the British mainland as originally planned. At that time, it will be exactly what the British want. However, what surprised the British was that the French fleet in the Irish Sea did not send ships to report the situation to the mainland. Instead, the French mainland sent several small spy ships for reconnaissance, but they were all intercepted by Wallace's fleet. The British couldn't figure it out. Was the commander of that fleet a fool? In the end, the British could only explain it this way. On the French side, they did not get much useful information. Because of the interception of more than a dozen warships under Wallace, the French spies got nothing. However, judging from the British's strict interception of spy ships, the battle in the Irish Sea seemed to be very fierce. After the main force of Kidd's fleet arrived in Dublin, escorting 30 cogs of more than 200 tons, Edward had already been waiting at the docks of Dublin with 10,000 troops. In order to facilitate landing, Edward ordered the construction of more than 20 long bridge docks along the coast of Dublin to facilitate the docking of Marin's ships. Because there was no obstruction from the English on the Irish Sea, Edward's army was now loading very smoothly. After loading the ship, the fleet crossed the Irish Sea directly and headed straight for the port city of Liverpool on the opposite bank. Kidd's warship team went first, sent troops ashore, and occupied the small port city of Liverpool. At this time, Liverpool was not the important port city of England in the future, but just a small seaside town. Therefore, Kidd's fleet easily occupied the small town of Liverpool, which lacked garrisons. Then, they began to build a temporary Longbridge wharf to meet the landing needs of Edward's army. At this time, Liverpool belonged to Chester County, later changed to Cheshire, and to the north of Chester County was Lancashire, the home of the Lancaster family. Because it was connected to Lancashire, Chester County also belonged to the sphere of influence of the Lancaster family. Therefore, after being looted by the Scots last time, Henry VII failed to take care of other counties in the north, nor did he take care of several counties in the middle, but he still provided relief to the two basic bases of Chester County and Lancashire. After all, no matter what, Lancashire is Henry VII's largest base, and Chester County and Lancashire are together. Therefore, these two counties received certain support from Henry VII. Of course, this is also because the two counties are close to the sea, and it is convenient for Henry VII to support them. As a representative of the York family, Edward naturally had no good feelings towards the people in these two counties. Therefore, after the soldiers landed, although Edward emphasized discipline, he also said that they didn't have to be so disciplined in Chestershire and Lancashire. This means that Edward acquiesced to his men robbing in these two counties. Before landing, Kidd found Edward and quietly told him that the action plan had changed. Although Marin's 20,000 troops landed in Newcastle, it was not suitable to come and join Edward at the moment. Moreover, Edward's army landing in Liverpool would definitely not escape Henry VII's eyes. Why? Because Chester County is close to Wales. Wales is one of the basic bases of the King of England, and every British Crown Prince is the Prince of Wales. Therefore, the royal family still has a strong control over Wales. Landing in Liverpool, which is close to Wales, is basically difficult to escape the fate of being discovered by the King of England's eyes. However, Marin is not worried about this, because this is for Henry VII to see. Marin is now hiding in the mountains and forests of Greater Northumberland with 20,000 men to avoid being discovered by Henry VII's spies. Because if Henry VII discovered Marin's 20,000 men, Henry VII might be so scared that he would not be in the mood to deal with the French. So, it is better not to scare Henry VII for now. Marin asked Kidd to tell Edward that he should take the Irish army that had landed and act alone, and he would have to wait for a while before he could lead his troops to join him. As for why, Kidd explained that Henry VII was currently making every effort to guard against France. If his army appeared too early, it might divert Henry VII's attention. At that time, if Henry VII sent the main force of the army to the north, the south would be empty. If the French took advantage of it, there would be no place to cry. Therefore, Marin decided to take 20,000 troops and hide in the mountains and forests of Northumberland for the time being. And Edward, because of his weak strength, did not dare to go south alone. Therefore, Marin gave a bad idea since he had no confidence in going south, he would go north. Where to go north? Naturally, it was Lancashire, north of Chestershire. That was the base camp of the Lancaster family, and there must be many big fish there. Therefore, Marin suggested that Edward lead his troops north to Lancashire first and massacre the forces of the Lancaster family left in their hometown of Lancashire. In this way, he could vent his personal anger. At the same time, he could avoid going south to confront Henry VII in advance. As for Henry VII, if his spies discovered that Edward's 10,000 men were acting alone, he would probably feel relieved. After all, Edward's own strength was definitely no match for Henry VII. In this way, Henry VII could focus on destroying the invading French. Chapter 650, The Manifesto against Henry. In Chestershire and Lancashire in the northwest of England, Edward's 10,000 troops swept and looted these two counties that were pro-Lancaster. All the support and assistance that Henry VII gave to these two basic counties that had been looted by Scotland was intercepted by Edward. Of course, Edward was not a fool. He did not exploit the serfs, but specifically dealt with the local nobles. Because these nobles were almost all Lancastrians, it was right to punish them. Moreover, the wealth of this era was mainly concentrated in the hands of the nobles. Punishing the nobles was equivalent to getting wealth. While Edward was dealing with these two Lancastrian counties, Marin leisurely took a group of men to hunt in the mountains and forests of Northumberland. Anyway, his army could not be shown to the world in a short time, so he could only shrink into the mountains and forests, so it was better to come out and relax. However, what made Marin depressed was that he led a large group of people and went around the mountains and forests, but he didn't catch many prey, especially larger prey such as deer. In the end, Marin and his hunting team only managed to kill a dozen rabbits and a few wild boars. After asking a local guide, I learned that the forests here were basically cleared by the locals. Because England advocates archery for all people, there are many folk hunting masters. After all, as long as you have good archery skills, you can easily hunt. Therefore, the deer and even wild wolves in the forest were killed very cleanly. Only wild boars, because their skin is too thick and it is difficult to shoot through with bows and arrows, most people dare not provoke them, but there are still many. There are also hares, because the target is small and difficult to shoot. In addition, rabbits reproduce very quickly, there are still some that can be hunted. Marin's hunting team is all equipped with clockwork ignition rifles, and those who bring them to the hunt are all people with good marksmanship. Therefore, the hunting team is not afraid of wild boars at all. Among the wild boars that were hunted, two majestic male wild boars had launched a desperate charge. But halfway through the charge, he was beaten into a sieve by the dense gunfire. But the consequence was that the wild boar skin was damaged. However, Marin was not a real hunter, so he naturally didn't care about the wild boar skin. He just enjoyed the fun of hunting. So, he didn't care if the wild boar skin was damaged, as long as he could eat wild boar meat. As for the wild rabbits that were hunted, Marin was actually speechless. Because one wild rabbit was not killed by them, but died on the tree by itself. Because of the fear of dense gunfire, the unlucky rabbit panicked and lost its balance. After a jump, its head hit a big tree hard and was directly killed by the big tree. Moreover, Marin saw it with his own eyes. So, it was quite speechless. Just when Marin was leisurely hunting in the mountains and forests, Henry VII's intelligence personnel also reported the size and whereabouts of Edward's army to Henry VII. 10,000 people. Not in a hurry to go south, but go to Lancashire in the north to rob. Henry VII fell into thought. Lancashire is of great significance to Henry VII. Because it is the place where the dragon rises. After all, Henry VII claims to be the representative of the Lancaster dynasty. But in fact, Henry VII is just a relative of the Lancaster family, and he was born in Wales and grew up in the Duchy of Brittany in France. However, many of Henry VII's supporters are from Lancashire. After all, the main support group for him to ascend the throne is the Lancastrian nobles. Of course, there are also Yorkist nobles who defected. However, after Henry VII became king, most of the Lancastrian nobles rose to heaven and moved to prosperous London. Most of those who stayed in Lancashire were unappreciated Lancastrian nobles, or branches who stayed in their homeland. Now, Edward's army looting in Lancashire must have damaged the interests of the Lancastrian nobles. After all, their poor relatives such as 7 aunts and 8 uncles, are still in Lancashire. Even many people's fiefs are still there. Therefore, now that Edward has plundered Lancashire, the Lancastrian nobles from Lancashire will certainly put pressure on Henry VII to urge him to send troops to retake Lancashire. However, Henry VII does not intend to do so. Because Henry VII feels that Edward's behavior is very abnormal. As a contender for the throne, shouldn't he actively go south to attack London? But Edward went to Lancashire to make trouble, which was clearly forcing him to send troops. After all, Lancashire was attacked, and the Lancastrian nobles would definitely be angry, and then urge him to send troops to suppress it. Thinking of this, plus the intelligence he had obtained before, Henry VII was even more certain Edward was attracting his attention so that he could relax his vigilance against France. If the army marched north to attack Edward, and France suddenly landed and besieged London, it would be the end of the world. In the end, Henry VII decided to ignore Edward for the time being and deal with Edward after he dealt with France. But Edward seemed unhappy with Henry VII's behavior. Just when Henry VII was concentrating on dealing with France, Edward publicly issued a manifesto to attack Henry VII. The false King Henry was born into a branch of the House of Lancaster. However, at the beginning, His Majesty Henry IV had announced that his half-brother, John Beaufort, Duke of Lancaster, and his descendants had no right to inherit the throne. What's more, the false King Henry was a collateral branch of the Lancastrian faction. Even the main line has no right to inherit the throne, let alone the branch line. Therefore, the false King Henry has no right to inherit the throne. His ascension to the throne is an usurpation and is illegal. What's more serious is that during the Battle of Bosworth, the false King Henry, together with his stepfather Thomas Stanley and other traitors, committed regicide and rebellion, which is an unforgivable capital crime. Anyone who commits regicide has no right to ascend the throne, even if he marries Princess Elizabeth. This is because Henry's descendants are descendants of criminals, and they are born guilty. The false King Henry has always insisted that His Majesty Richard III ascended the throne by regicide, but he has been on the throne for 20 years, and no evidence has been found to prove that His Majesty Richard III committed regicide. Therefore, his statement is invalid and illegal. The great kingdom of England follows the rule of law. Without evidence, there can be no conviction. In the absence of evidence of His Majesty Richard III's regicide, rashly sending troops to rebel is an unforgivable crime. Therefore, the false King Henry is the real regicide. As the legitimate heir to the throne of Richard III, I declare myself to be Edward VI. Now, in the name of the legitimate king, I declare the false King Henry and his evil followers to be regicides, and they should be punished by law. But out of piety to God and respect for the law, I will not kill this false king at will. Because only killing through trial is legal and in line with God's will. Therefore, after I capture London, I will publicly try this false king and his accomplices in front of the palace. Then, in the name of God, this false king and his accomplices will be hanged to uphold the law and maintain the justice of the kingdom. This manifesto is written with great righteousness and reason, and it is really hard to find any fault with it. Moreover, its argument for upholding the law can arouse people's approval. For example, it is well known that Henry IV declared that John Beaufort and his descendants had no right of inheritance. Therefore, legally speaking, Henry VII, as a descendant of John Beaufort and a collateral descendant, was indeed not eligible to inherit the throne. It was just that Henry VII and his supporters deliberately avoided this issue. Now, this manifesto has brought up this matter, which will definitely cause the public to question Henry VII's right to inherit the throne. The fact that Henry VII had been on the throne for 20 years but no evidence had been found that Richard III had killed the king had proved that the rebellion of Henry VII and his followers was illegal from a legal perspective. If it could not be proved that Richard III had killed the king, then Henry VII and his followers were the real regicides and should be executed. Such a well-reasoned and well-founded manifesto was naturally not something that could be written by an ordinary person like Edward, who had been imprisoned for more than 10 years, but by our time traveler, Uncle Marin. Because there was really no prey to be caught in the forests of Northumberland, Marin suddenly remembered that in the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, the 18 princes attacked Dongjua. It seemed that Chen Lin, one of the 7 scholars of the Jianan period, first wrote a very literary manifesto to attack Dongjua and published it to the world to prove his legal status and just demands, which also angered Dongjua. So Marin also tried to help Edward write a manifesto to defeat Henry, and gave it to Edward to publish in order to seek support from the people and European countries. At the same time, it further hit Henry VII's reputation. After Edward received the manifesto against Henry, written by Marin, he read it and loved it. He also knew that this manifesto was indeed very powerful, so he immediately organized a copy and sent people to post it everywhere.